All right. Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Restored Mind Show. My name is Matt Cotty, and thank you so much for being here today. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about this idea of having anxiety over losing a job, right? And so what I'm really talking about this is a question that I get frequently is like, this idea of, well, what if I lose my job, right? Meaning that you currently have a position or you have a job or maybe you own a company and your mind is jumping into this idea of, well, what if I lose that? Or what if something bad happens? What if a change happens, essentially, is what our mind is, really coming up with. And then what happens is with anxiety is that it starts stacking on those second and third level questions like, well, if I lose my job, what am I going to do for money? How am I going to pay rent? Am I going to be able to eat? Am I going to go homeless, right? And our mind slowly just goes down this rabbit hole of catastrophizing the whole thing. And so I want to talk about this question because I think this is very applicable right now. I mean, we're in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty, especially in the United States. And companies are shutting down. Things are, things are just happening new each and every day, And so as we continue on this series of anxiety in the workplace, I feel like it's a good next question to answer, right? So in the first two parts of this, we talked about, having anxiety when you're unemployed. Then we talked about workplace anxiety. So when you feel just like anxious at work, and we talked about 3 reasons that might happen. And then today I want to talk about this idea of anticipating that you might lose a job or that something might change. And so let's start off with kind of point number 1 here. And this is something with anxiety that's really important to consider, right? One of the problems with anxiety is that our mind assumes that change is bad, right? It makes this default assumption, change is bad. And when you think about that, it's like, well, we all know change is always happening, right? Like it's happening every day, all the time. Things are changing, right? In fact, nothing ever stays the same, right? Feelings, thoughts, relationships, plants, nothing stays as it is, right? We're always changing, always evolving. And so this idea that change is bad, really what's happening is that part of the mind, that part of the mind that, is that voice of the mind wanting to protect you, it can't anticipate change, right? It can't anticipate what might happen in life. And so it comes up with this what if thought about, the job in this instance, right? And when that what if thought happens, well, then our mind goes into trying to problem solve it, right? When we react to that initial what if thought, like I need to really figure that out in case that happens, then our brain goes into problem solving mode. And that's really the difference between an anxious mind or someone who really struggles with anxiety and someone who doesn't, is that a person, that part of the mind is a wonderful tool, right? That ability to problem solve, but it's a horrible master, right? And what happens in an anxious mind that I've seen, not only with myself, but also with, many people that I've worked with, is that part of your mind creates the problem and then tries to solve it all on autopilot. Like you're not even involved. You're just experiencing the whole thing, right? Whereas if you are actually able to look at a problem and choose when to use that part of your mind to problem solve, then it becomes a wonderful gift and a wonderful tool, right? But when your mind is creating a problem and trying to solve it without you really being involved, and what I mean by that is kind of like that higher sense of self, right? Really being involved. That's a real issue because it can come up with problem after problem after problem. And this is what happens with anxiety, especially when it comes to really anything, is that it just comes up with the next problem, the next problem, the next problem. And so I know people who have wrestled with this question about, well, what if I lose my job for years and they're still at the same job? Think about how much needless suffering is going on there, right? Just week after week, am I going to lose my job next week? Or how about this? And it's like, oh, we're going to be doing layoffs. Am I going to be part of that? And it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. Now, for those of us that have ever lost a job before, we do know it is stressful and it is tough. But the best time to deal with it is if it actually happens. Right? And so kind of for 2 reasons. One, if you're worrying about losing your job, you're probably not focused on your job, which means you're more likely to do bad at the job, right? Which means you are not as well as you could, which ultimately means, you could actually jeopardize yourself for losing the job, ironically. But two, it's like, it's needless suffering, right? I think it was Sir Winston Churchill that said it, when he was on his deathbed. He said, I've experienced a lot of suffering in my life, and most of it never actually happened. And it's like, what better way to articulate anxiety, right? And most of anxiety in my experiences is needless suffering, right? And because even if that event actually happens, you still are going to have to experience it, right? And so it's like, might as well enjoy what you have while you have it. And then if that change comes, you handle it and navigate it then. And so the second thing is the first assumption is that change is bad. But the second assumption is having this internal belief that I won't be able to handle the change when it happens, right? And this is something that I just, I want to kind of challenge in this episode. If this is something you struggle with, and this again can be applied to anything, but specifically with jobs, it's like, this idea that I can't handle change or it's going to be too much for me. I challenge you to look back on your life and say, okay, well, like, when was a challenging time that I actually had something happen and, I wasn't sure how I was going to handle it, but I got through it, right? Whatever that was. And I just want you to think of a time that happened. And I know they're there. So just give yourself a second, wherever you are, just take a second and think of that. It's like, and really see that, like, yeah, wait, I was able to handle that, right? Because part of challenging these beliefs that often are underneath us is being able to think of an exception to that belief, right? Oftentimes we think that our brain just, it generates something and we just immediately assume it's true. It's a truism, right? It's a fact, right? I won't be able to handle it. But a lot of times there's contrary evidence to that. And really taking that and looking at it, it's so important. And so that's that second thing I want to talk about, is just that idea of realizing that you probably can, and you can handle it, and you will handle it when it happens. The time that you can't handle it is before it happens, because you don't know what's going to happen, right? Like, that's the point of anxiety, right? It's going to feel like you can't handle it because your brain's going to be coming up with 18 different scenarios that could happen, right? Oh, the company could lose money. They could lay me off. I could get fired, this, and this, right? But when the event actually happens, then it's so crystal clear on what you need to do. And that's why, things like practicing mindfulness and meditation and learning how to stay more in the moment, in the present moment, is so helpful for anxiety, right? That's one of the things we teach in Restored Minds. It's one of the tools. But I mean, a lot of how you interact with the mind and how you interact with emotions is really where the foundational work is. And the final thing I want to talk about is the idea that when it comes to anxiety over losing a job, the last thing I'll say is that most of the time when I've seen people lose jobs, in many cases, much better opportunities have presented themselves to them, and trusting that not only will you be able to handle it, but maybe something even better awaits me. And when we're able to challenge the narrative that, and when our mind just comes up with this bad, this what if thought about the future that's negative, and then we just run with it and take it into a negative spot, when we're able to challenge that idea and say, okay, yeah, you know what, that could happen. And if it does, I'll cross that bridge when I get there. And then, you know what, on top of that, maybe a better opportunity will present itself if it does. Because you don't know, right? You really don't, right? And we need to watch just how negative our mind goes on the default, and not let it just run, right? I mean, that is the problem with the anxious mind, is that it comes up with the problems on its own and then tries to solve them. And our true self, right, our higher sense of self, is in many ways just watching the whole thing happen, right? It's just like, it's coming up with this problem and this problem and this problem. And the more credence we give it, the more we try to solve it, and it just leads us in this vicious loop. And so when it comes to anxiety about losing a job, unless you're being warned and written up at work, okay, that's something that, writing might be on the wall there, right? You need to kind of like, okay, get ready. And in some cases, but if there's no evidence to suggest that, it's like the best thing you can do is live in the present, live now, and enjoy what you have and be grateful for what you have, right? So if you have a position, or if you have a company, or things are going, it's like with even, especially right now, I mean, there's just so much uncertainty, and it's like, you know what? Take one day at a time. And that's the only real logical way to live this life, because we don't know what the future holds. But what's important to remember is that you do have the ability to deal with it, because you always have up to this point. You've always dealt with today, right? And you've done it well. You're here. What you don't have the ability to do is anticipate what tomorrow's going to bring and then conquer all of those problems today. That's impossible. And that's where the suffering and anxiety really comes. And so, I hope this has been helpful for any of you that wrestle with this question, or just anxiety in general. And, we have some more helpful resources. We have a free, guide on rules for dealing with anxiety, as well as free assessments as well over on our site, Restored Minds. And for those of you that found this helpful, we always appreciate if you like and subscribe, comment, and give us feedback. We love to hear from our community. Just want to say thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Happy 4th of July. I know we're a little late now, but just happy 4th of July to everyone. And hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care.